In 1914, when the war began, it was the world's fourth largest economy, and it covered 15% of the world's landmass. It had what seemed like an endless supply of men, and they patriotically went to war in support of their leader. And yet, 3 years later, that empire was in tatters and racked by revolution. I'm talking, of course, about Russia. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to a Great War special episode about Russia and the First World War. Russia had been ruled for 2 decades by Tsar Nicholas II when the war began. He had ascended to the throne in 1894 at the age of 26 upon his father's death. That same year, the Zemstvos, a collection of peasants and workers that made up local governments that had been instituted by Nicholas's grandfather Alexander II, brought a proposal to Nicholas for adopting a European-style constitutional monarchy and socio-economic and civil rights reforms for the peasantry. That group, mainly subsistence farmers, made up 82% of the population. Nicholas denounced the idea as senseless dreams. He would rule by autocracy. Now, Alexander II had made sweeping reforms decades earlier after the Russian loss in the Crimean War. He modernized his empire's military-industrial complex. He expanded the scope of the railways and communications. But most importantly, he modernized Russia's military personnel, which had been mainly serfs. Seeing the defeat of the Russian serf army by the free British and French armies, he enacted the Emancipation Reform of 1861, which effectively abolished serfdom in the empire over the course of a few years. Eventually, he was even planning constitutional reform through the proposed Loris-Melikov Constitution, whose contents were a little more modest than the name might suggest, but which would have made Russia a constitutional monarchy. On February 16, 1881, the executive consultation in which Alexander participated unanimously approved the project, and on March the 1st, Alexander told Loris-Melikov that the Council of Ministers would discuss it in 4 days. That same day, Alexander was assassinated by an anarchist group, and any progressive government or civil reforms died with him. Alexander III ascended to the throne, dismissed the project, and ruled as an absolute monarch. You can imagine that this stirred up a fair amount of civil unrest, but through sheer force of character and iron will, Alexander kept order in his empire. His reign was cut short in 1894 by kidney disease, and he had never taken the time to teach his son, now Tsar Nicholas II, how to be a proper monarch and maintain peace and order. Nicholas inherited an immense job, personally ruling the world's second largest empire, and as time passed, it became quite clear how ill-prepared he was for a job that, on many levels, he didn't even want and thought was a burden. But he did it because he believed in divine right, that he and the Tsarina had been chosen to rule by God and had to do it like it or not. He wanted to continue his father's policies, but Russia was entering the modern age, and the political landscape was shifting beneath Nicholas's feet, and his father's policies would need a very strong ruler to carry them out, which Nicholas was not. Still, for the first 10 years of his rule, Russia flourished. A lot of the credit for that goes to Finance Minister Sergei Witte and Prime Minister and Minister of Internal Affairs Pyotr Stolypin. Russia became one of Europe's fastest-growing economies, expanding at 4% annually. Then came 1905. Russia suffered a surprising and humiliating defeat to Japan in the Russo-Japanese War, and they had considered Japan a secondary power. Morale plummeted, and you saw major economic stagnation. There was an unprecedented wave of worker strikes and demonstrations that targeted landlords, industry, and the government. The strikes and civil unrest led to the 1905 Russian Revolution, and also to a series of anti-Jewish pogroms. Now, the Russian military remained loyal to the Tsar during the revolution, so Nicholas was not removed from power, but he was forced to sign the October Manifesto, which promised basic civil rights and created a parliamentary body, the Duma. Nicholas hated this, though, and undermined it at every turn. He had actually wanted to create a sort of a military dictatorship with Grand Duke Nikolai at the helm, but Nikolai threatened to shoot himself in the head if the Tsar did not sign the Manifesto. From then until the First World War, Russia's economy had something of a recovery, but the promised constitutional government never developed. Nicholas ceded none of his power and would dissolve the Duma again and again, rendering it into a feckless entity cooperative with his own policy. This served to foment underground dissent, and there was a series of assassinations of Tsarist officials, including the governor-generals of Moscow and Finland and Stolypin himself in 1911. And then came the war. Nicholas called for all citizens to stand united against the Central Powers, and to the surprise of many, they did. The peasantry went to war with great patriotism, and Nicholas, for maybe the first time in his reign, enjoyed great popularity. Okay, everybody thought it would be a short war. People like economic journalist Norman Angell thought modern war had become unprofitable, and a drawn-out conflict had become impossible. Industrialized economies were so bound together by trade that a conflict of any duration would lead quickly to collapse, starvation, and revolution. Russian financier I.S. Bliok wrote that it was agrarian economies such as Russia, with a large population of subsistence farmers and a cushion of net food exports, that would stand up best when global trade was disrupted and the industrialized economies fell down. Both of those guys were very wrong. Backed by massive military-industrial complexes, the war grew to a scale never before seen. It also turned out that the industrial economies were actually better suited for mobilizing national resources. I'm not going to talk about Russian involvement in the war, since I cover all that in the regular episodes. But there were both great successes and great disasters. Nicholas made what can only be regarded as a serious error when he personally took command of the army in September 1915. This meant that any military failures in both the field or in supply rested on his shoulders. The nation's economy could not handle the strain of the war. The unpopular Tsarina and even more unpopular Rasputin wielded great influence in Petrograd, and as the misery continued and food shortages became endemic, strikes and demonstrations broke out on an almost daily basis, culminating in the February Revolution that saw Nicholas abdicate, abandoned even by his own armies that had saved him in 1905. Today, I really wanted to look a bit at Russia before the war. Heading into the 20th century, Russia found itself racing to adapt to the modernization of the rest of the European powers. The economy expanded thanks to people like Witte and Stolypin, but progress was stifled by the inflexibility of the autocratic rule of Nicholas II. Crushing or dismissing all opposition, he and the larger part of the ruling class disregarded the public unrest coming from below. Ignoring the warnings and lessons of the 1905 revolution, he failed to see how broken and outdated his system was. And that didn't just affect the civilian population, but also the economy and the military. All of the Russian Empire's woes were exposed in 1917 when the demoralized, exhausted, and angry public joined together and ended 304 years of Romanov rule. If you'd like to see our special episode about Rasputin, you can click right here for that. And do not forget to follow us on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and all the other social media things that you can think of, because we're all over them. Aren't we, Flo?
Yes.
Yes, we are. See you next time.